All right, so now we're going to make things a little bit more complicated. Remember, we talked about, up until now, we have talked about how the number of electron regions corresponds to the electron geometry, and how as long as that central atom doesn't have the lone pairs, that's going to correspond to the molecular geometry. So how do we deal with molecules that do have lone pairs on their central atom? We still are going to derive the molecular geometry from the electron geometry, but they're not going to be the exact same. Okay, so how do we do that? So, for example, let's just remind ourselves how we got to methane, or how we got this molecular geometry for methane. We said methane had 1, 2, 3, 4 electron regions. This corresponded to an electron geometry that was a tetrahedral. And since there are no lone pairs on that central atom, this is also the molecular geometry. Molecular geometry is also tetrahedral. Cool. Now let's do a molecule that does have a lone pair on that central atom. Okay. So here we have ammonia. We see that ammonia has 1, 2, 3, 4 electron regions. And that means that its electron, electron, we can actually write it here. The electron geometry is tetrahedral. Right? So that means that those electron clouds are oriented as a tetrahedral. So for example, if I'm going to color code, let me do that here actually. Each bond is represented in red. And then the lone pair is also in this shape. So that corresponds to that group there, right? But if I'm looking at the molecular geometry, I'm only caring about the arrangements of atoms. So how do we get the molecular geometry from the electron geometry? What we're going to do is just take that bond that corresponds to that lone pair, and we're going to just erase it, right? Because that's not a bonding pair of electrons, it's just a lone pair. So that gives you the geometry of the molecule. And so this is what we would have for our molecular geometry, right? Where this is our lone pair. This is what we call, so now we got, right, we had to learn 3 new words for the geometries last lecture. We're gonna have 2 more that we're gonna learn. This is what's called a trigonal pyramidal geometry. So the electron geometry of ammonia is a tetrahedral, but the molecular geometry is a trigonal pyramidal. Okay. What about for water? So water has 1, 2, 3, 4 electron regions. So that means 4 electron regions. So that means a electron geometry of tetrahedral. But now 2 of those correspond to bonds, and the other 2 correspond to lone pairs. So again, how am I going to get the molecular geometry from the electron geometry? I'm going to erase those lone pair bonds. Okay, so this would be the molecular geometry of water. This is what we call a bent shape. All right, so the electron geometry of water is a tetrahedral. Whoops. The molecular geometry is bent. Okay. So again, you start out with that electron geometry. You always start out with the electron geometry. Simply count the number of electron regions that directly corresponds to what the electron geometry is. One, it's always going to be linear. I'm sorry, if there's 2 electron regions, it's always going to be linear. If there's 3 electron regions, it'll always start out as a trigonal planar. And if there are 4 electron regions, it'll always be tetrahedral. To get the molecular geometry, we start erasing the bonds that correspond to lone pairs. Okay, let's do another one, starting out with, this is now the nitrite ion. This molecule has resonance, right? So notice how I had to include both. And actually, what we would do, because we're really good, is put those in these brackets as well. Okay, if I'm going to count the number of electron regions, actually I only have to look at one of these 2 structures. It'll be the same for both of them, but I'm going to go in here. This is, actually use the same colors. 1, 2, remember that double bonds still only count as 1 electron region. So this was 1, 2, and then 3. The nitrite ion has 3 electron regions. 1, 2, 3. The double bond counts as just 1 electron region. The single bond counts as another electron region, and then the lone pair is our 3rd electron region. So that means that our electron geometry is trigonal planar. Right? 2 of those electron regions were the bonding regions, and the 3rd corresponded to that lone pair. So just like before, what am I going to do? I'm going to go in and erase that one that corresponds to the lone pair. And that will give me the bent geometry. So this is also what we call a bent geometry of the nitrite ion. So the molecular geometry is bent. Notice we had a bent when we started out with tetrahedral electron geometry with 2 lone pairs. We also have a bent if we start out with a trigonal planar electron geometry and have only 1 lone pair. There is a difference between the 2 bents. So first of all, let's just review. Here's the electron geometry and here's the molecular geometry. Again, it depends on how many electron groups there are, but then also the number of lone pairs on the central atom. And so the 5 words that you got to have kind of memorized are linear, bent, trigonal planar, trigonal pyramidal, and tetrahedral. Okay. The difference between trigonal planar and trigonal pyramidal is in the trigonal planar, all 3 of those atoms are in the same plane, so that shape is flat. Whereas in the trigonal pyramidal, it's kind of standing up like a tripod or like a triangle-based pyramid. So they are different. The other thing to point out is the difference between starting out with the tetrahedral and having the bent geometry versus starting out with the trigonal planar and having a bent geometry is the bond angle. So the angle between those bonds is going to be 120 for the bent when you have 3 electron regions, and 109.5 for the bent when you have the tetrahedral. Okay. Let's talk about electron geometry real quick. So first of all, in terms of the linear shape, this can occur anytime you have 2 electron regions, right? So this would be 1, 2, this would be 1, 2, this would be 1, 2. Notice that it doesn't matter the bond order. Each one of these electron region, or each one of these bonds of any order. So this double bond counts as 1, 2 electron region. This single bond counts as 1, and that triple bond counts as another 1. And then these 2 single bonds. These will all lead to linear geometries. Okay, so when we're talking about bond angle, we're talking about the angle between those 2 bonds. So if it's linear, they're going to be 180 degrees apart from one another, right? That angle between those two, it's a line, so it's 180 degrees. For the trigonal planar structures, these atoms are oriented like in a triangle, and so they're oriented 120 degrees away from one another. And that's why when we have the bent molecule, for example, we saw it for the nitrite ion. This bent molecule has a bond angle of 120 degrees because it sort of started out with that trigonal planar electron geometry. When we get to a tetrahedral, all four of those bonds, so this bond angle is the same as this bond angle is the same as this bond angle, they are all equal to 109.5. Okay, so that means that as well as in our shape for ammonia that we saw, these started out with that tetrahedral bond geometry or electron geometry. So these are also 109.5 degrees, as well as, whoops, we have water. That started out as that tetrahedral electron geometry. So this bond angle is also 109.5 degrees. So the bond angle is dependent on the electron geometry. The electron geometry will tell you how the angle between those different electron groups, which then will tell you the bond angle once you get to the molecular geometry. Okay. Yeah, so again, if we have the tetrahedral is actually a way to arrange 4 atoms around a central atom such that they're all perfectly evenly spaced. And again, that's kind of a weird number, but we got to know it, 109.5. And that's the angle between all of those bonds in this structure.